Which property goal should we be tackling first? Answering this question right now as part of Start Here. Welcome back, everyone, to Start Here, the very special mini-series within Sugar Mama's Fire Play, where I answer your real-life money questions with confidence, with clarity, and with actionable steps to help you get started and move forward. Today's question comes from a listener in her late 40s who wrote, "Hi Canna, my husband and I are in our late 40s and would really appreciate your guidance. We have $30,000 left on our mortgage, both work full-time, and for personal reasons, we don't want to invest in shares. I have $180,000 in super and my husband has none. We have a few goals we'd like help prioritizing. Building a granny flat to rent out, buying a small apartment overseas in my husband's home country, which we may also rent out when not using it, and eventually purchasing a 2-bedroom investment unit here in Australia. Our questions are, what is the smartest order to pursue these goals? How could each option realistically generate rental income for us? And how can we best start saving to actually achieve these goals? Thank you so much for your advice." Okay, first of all, thank you so much for your honesty and thank you so much for trusting me with such big financial dreams and goals. These are really thoughtful goals, and the fact that you're asking me how to prioritize rather than just rushing in headfirst into something that you may not fully understand tells me that you're going to make some really wise decisions here. Now, before we dive in, I need to make something abundantly clear. This is general advice only. I don't know anything about your financial situation. I only know the surface level details. So I can't tell you exactly what to do. But what I can do is help you understand the key considerations, the risks, the strategic order in which these decisions often flow, and the essential questions to be asking a financial planner and an accountant before you move forward. So together right now, we're going to break this down step by step to help you get started. All right, step number 1, and this part I think is the most exciting part for you, and that is to clarify your goals, but also the time horizon for these goals. This is essential. When you have multiple goals like these, especially property goals, the first step is not to choose which one feels the most exciting, as tempting as it may be. You need to take a moment to stop and ask yourself a few questions to get a really deep understanding as to what's going on here and what really does matter and why. So there are some simple questions I would recommend you ask yourself, such as, why does this particular goal have the most emotion attached to it? What is it behind it that really means something to you? Which goal is urgent? Which one do you want to get done as a priority? Which goal is actually the most financially efficient one to attack and to, get started with that will actually help you be financially independent? And what are the timeframes for each of these goals? Questioning the efficiency, taking away the emotions, understanding what is actually going to serve you and actually make life easier for you in your late 40s in building wealth now, particularly because you've got such a small mortgage and you're at such a sweet spot where you really are going to see your wealth accelerate if you make the right decisions. So, for example, you might look at the granny flat and think, this is one that we really should prioritize because it's not going to cost too much to build, perhaps, and it will start earning a rental income for us really quickly. And then you might look at, say, the overseas apartment, and you think, well, that's actually more of a lifestyle-driven goal rather than a financial one. So perhaps we can just hold off on that for the time being. And then you might go through the idea of the Australian investment property, and you think, that's actually going to be the foundation of our wealth accumulation journey. So perhaps we need to actually set up an account that starts saving now, not necessarily buy. Really spend time exploring each of these goals and understanding why you want to achieve these goals and what they represent and how they're going to add efficiency to you and your financial goals. Your timelines really do matter here, because if you are in your late 40s, your retirement is, say, in the next 15 to 20 years. So we want to make sure that your cash flow, the level of debt that you take on, the tax structure that you may use, and of course, superannuation, they all support these goals and they're actually all working together in harmony. And this is where a financial planner can really add so much value here and so much clarity. Whilst a financial planner cannot recommend direct property as such, they can run some really helpful projections to help you gain some important clarity and insight as to which one would be most efficient for you to actually work on immediately as a priority. And then you can add back in the emotions to help you make the best decision that serves your goals, but also helps soothe your lifestyle goals as well. This is so incredibly important. Don't begin this process without doing this step. So the next step is to understand the value of superannuation. This part is vital. You mentioned that you have $180,000 in your super and your husband has none. Okay, I'm going to be really honest here. I had alarm bells ringing when I read that. And whilst you are focusing on property, which is obviously a long-term growth asset, can I deeply encourage both of you to just pause and consider a few things, mainly around superannuation. Yes, property will help build your wealth, but superannuation also helps you build wealth, but in a far more tax efficient, passive, and sometimes possibly a more reliable way than owning a property directly outside of super. Superannuation is taxed at 15% as an absolute maximum under current legislation. Property rental income is taxed at your marginal tax rates unless you're using, company structures or tax structures. The reason I mention this is if your husband has zero super at his age, then contributing to his super, even just modestly, may be one of the highest value, lowest risk wealth strategies that you could actually put into place and get started with today. So remember, you can make spouse contributions. You also may be eligible for co-contributions. And this is, again, where a financial plan will be so helpful. And you could probably both look at some salary sacrificing strategies. But I would not be ignoring your superannuation. I would really be prioritizing this, if I was you, and getting some professional personal advice as soon as possible. And by no means does focusing on super mean that you are, giving up on your goals around investing in property. In fact, a financial planner may even suggest looking at a self-managed super fund. But these are things that you've got to consider if you are really serious about building wealth over the next 15 to 20 years and setting yourselves up to be financially independent. Superannuation is going to seriously strengthen your financial foundation dramatically. Okay, step number 3. Sorry, I get a little bit passionate sometimes. And that is seeking professional advice early. Now, because one of your goals involves property outside of Australia, this is a non-negotiable for me. You need a licensed financial planner, and they can help you model the cash flow, look at the risks, the retirement outcomes, all the loopholes, that is the legal loopholes, and obviously that sequence of your goals. An accountant, though, an accountant who specializes in international tax, specifically the tax laws in your husband's home country. Now, you might be thinking, why? Well, this is really important. You get it wrong, it could be very expensive to fix and come with a lot of regrets. So some countries have, foreign tax ownership rules, and they're quite different to what we have here. There also may be double tax rental income. You also may need to lodge your taxes in 2 different jurisdictions. There also may be withholding taxes, and in some countries, foreigners can't actually borrow money, which means if you want to buy a property overseas, you may potentially have to pay for it outright, which means cash, which means having a lot of savings ready to go. Your overseas purchase might still be a wonderful goal. I'm not here to get in your way, but it's important that you understand the tax, the legal issues, and the ownership implications before you start transferring any money overseas and going and buying a property. So please go and see an accountant that specializes in international tax as well as a financial planner. Step number 4. Okay, let's talk about the granny flat here. A granny flat can be a fantastic first goal. because it can obviously generate rental income pretty quickly, depending on where you live. Some granny flats rent out for, say, $350 to $600 per week. In fact, one of my really good friends has built a granny flat recently, and she rents it out on Airbnb and is doing really well. That might be an option for you for short-term leasing. And also, the fact that you already own the land, this increases your return on your investment because you're not paying for that underlying property all over again. And you're almost mortgage free, only $30,000 left on your mortgage. You may be able to borrow for the construction relatively easily without expensive interest, depending on obviously on the bank's assessment. So these are the things I would really consider. Obviously, the council rules and approvals, you've got to get a DA, you've got building costs. Will the rental income affect any future tax issues that you may have? Obviously, there is the ongoing maintenance, the wear and tear. There's also privacy and lifestyle impacts. You've got someone essentially living in your backyard. But then there's also the massive upside. This can really help fund another investment. So that, say, $350 per week that it pays you could help build up a deposit to help fund that Australian investment property that you spoke about. This is exciting. This is that flow-on effect, that domino effect, where you can see your wealth really start to explode when you set things up correctly, wisely, and with proactive advice and consideration. That rental income from the granny flat will speed up your savings, and it could actually be a really smart move. And then step number 5, and that is the overseas apartment. Now, this is where emotions and logic really need to work together. Lifestyle property is beautiful. It's a luxury, but the thing is, with eyes wide open, those rose-tinted glasses taken off, it rarely yields high rental returns because it's your home and you're using it, say, as a holiday home or, sort of limited times during the year. You need that access. So there could be long vacancies. You also may face foreign ownership rules, particularly if those rules change. And you've got to understand the tax obligations both in Australia and in your husband's home country. This could be incredibly complicated. And then there's, of course, the currency fluctuations. This can work for you or it can work against you. So timing here of transferring money and taking rental income back is going to be really needs to be mindfully navigated with fluctuating currencies. But on the other side, it can also be a wonderful goal if you plan to use it on a regular basis. You can afford to use it without any financial strain. And you've got some fantastic advice with amazing clarity around how the rules work in both countries. So this is why I recommend the overseas property may be considered after you've got some really detailed and documented financial advice from an accountant, and that you have worked out whether it really is actually an income-producing asset after all. One way of thinking about this may be letting the granny flat help fund this particular dream, not the other way around. Step 6, the Australian 2-bedroom investment unit. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, it sounds like this asset, the Australian investment property, will be your ultimate long-term wealth builder. Australian property is familiar. We can touch it, we can see it, we can drive past it. Obviously, it's a lot easier to manage because we're nearby. We can finance it a lot easier. The banks obviously aren't going to go and fund a property overseas that's not on their asset books. It's also easier to insure, and you can have a much clearer understanding of where all the boundaries are when it comes to tax. And obviously it's going to vary from country to country and area to area, but it might be perhaps more reliable for those long-term growth and income opportunities. However, when it comes to buying property, particularly if you're going to be borrowing to invest, you need to have a really strong cash flow, and especially if interest rates start to move north again. And this is where your retirement timeline really does matter here. In fact, it comes in quite a heavy factor here. If you're planning to invest in your 50s, the property that is this investment property, it's got to make sure that it's affordable and that it creates a sustainable cash flow, and you have a sustainable cash flow to help pay it off. You're never pushing yourself into this mortgage stress. And, this does actually work for your long-term wealth creation strategy. For most couples in your situation, this goal becomes the goal number 3, perhaps, after your granny flat and after you've established some of your superannuation goals and some contributions into superannuation as well. So it is something that's worth thinking about. It's worth something saving up a deposit for and getting some advice on and speaking to your bank or a mortgage broker as to what your limits may be and how you structure this in a way where you are paying it off and you pay it off within a time frame that works for your retirement plans. So get advice, speak to your mortgage broker, speak to the bank, and do your research. And of course, get that deposit building up as quickly as possible. Step number 7, and that is, how do we actually prioritize all of these very exciting goals? So based on everything that you've shared with me, this is my general advice only, I guess, framework on just how to prioritize this. So what I would be thinking first is paying off your remaining mortgage could be something incredibly helpful. You've only got $30,000 left, and becoming debt-free gives you enormous cash flow power. I just mentioned about the importance of saving up a deposit. When you redirect your previous mortgage repayments towards a savings account, that deposit for the investment property or that money to help build the granny flat becomes a reality. Which takes me to number 2, building that granny flat first. As we mentioned, it's an income-producing asset, which may help work towards your passive income goals, which means you can start generating rental income quickly. It increases the value of your home, very much so, and it helps fund your international and local property goals. And if it's in Australia, which obviously is where you're living right now, you have amazing clarity around the legal tax and rental market. So then I would be working on number 3, and that is your husband's superannuation. Even if you were to look at doing, say, $50 or $100 per week, as salary sacrificing or an after-tax contribution into his super, this really can help transform his retirement income. I have mentioned the immediate tax savings that come from superannuation. Obviously, I'm not privy to your marginal tax rates, but for the average Australian that's on about 35% marginal tax rate, that is a significant savings. This is so incredibly important, particularly if the legislation remains as is, and when you go to retire further down the track, some of that income can come back to you potentially tax-free. So please make sure you start looking at superannuation once you start building that granny flat. And again, that granny flat income may actually end up helping fund the superannuation contributions. Number 4, considering the overseas apartment. Look, I would only consider this after you've spoken with an accountant with international tax expertise and a financial planner, and if needed, a lender in the country that you're looking to potentially buy. Please promise me that you will make sure you fully understand the ownership rules, the taxes, the rental laws, and whether foreign buyers can actually borrow at all, because this actually may be a bit of a roadblock for you that you'll be glad you discovered sooner rather than later. So do your research. Then finally, the Australian investment property. That comes last. So once you've built your granny flat and it's rented out, paying you some fantastic passive income, you've still mortgage free, your debt levels, that is your investment debt levels, are easy to manage, they're coming down, or you've actually paid everything off as well, and you can have some great confidence around what you want from your retirement planning, when you want to retire, on how much income, and everything feels stable. And you've obviously built up your husband's superannuation. It feels like both of you are back on track. This is the time that potentially you could look at that investment property. And that investment property may actually supplement or even actually be part of your overall superannuation strategy, such as a self-managed super fund. Again, this is where that advice comes in, that personal advice that knows the nitty-gritty, finer details of your situation, who you are, what you stand for, what your risk profile is, and knows to a much deeper level as to what your goals are really about and who you're about. They can design the best strategy for you. So how do we start saving for each of these goals, which is such a brilliant question. So to give you some really practical steps to follow to help you get started, can I, number 1, recommend you do a budget if you haven't done one already. This will let you see where you're potentially wasting money that you can then use to pay off the home loan faster or to help pay for the costs of that granny flat. Number 2 would be to create a dedicated property goals account. Having a separate savings account away from your normal spending account and nicknaming it, say granny flat. This is where you have a clearly defined place to put all extra savings to help save up to be able to build that granny flat and start earning that passive income. Then I would start practicing the repayments. If you needed to borrow money for the granny flat, which I'm going to assume here, you might want to maybe look at doing a bit of a dress rehearsal. So this is where you pretend you have a loan of, say, $200,000, and you work out what the repayments would look like at, say, an interest rate of, say, 7% at the moment to be conservative. You can actually see what those repayments look like and whether you can still actually service them without any stress. If you do find it stressful, that's your sign that perhaps you need to build up a bigger deposit, or maybe look at borrowing less money so that when you do build that granny flat, you're not overextending yourself. But this is a great practice and something I would also recommend for when you buy that investment property as well. The next thing is to automate as much as you possibly can. When you've looked at your budget and you look at what you can save, try and set up a regular savings plan, whether it be fortnightly, monthly, or even weekly. I recommend trying and doing this so that it comes out a couple of days after you get paid. So you're prioritizing paying for yourself first. And then, of course, emergency money. You haven't mentioned this in your DM to me, but if you don't have emergency money, can you please make sure you build that emergency money up sooner rather than later? You cannot afford to be investing confidently without having a safety net behind you. This is a non-negotiable. And then, of course, speak to your bank about your borrowing power. When you understand the details of your financial situation, which comes from speaking with a good quality mortgage broker or your bank, you have so much understanding and clarity around what your responsibilities are, what your personal debts are and how to keep them minimized as much as possible, how to make sure that your credit score is nice and healthy, how to actually build those consistent, healthy savings habits, and why thinking about having a stable employment where possible can actually also help improve your borrowing power. The cleaner and clearer your financial picture is, the more options you will have. And also, you'll be able to see better opportunities far more efficiently than when things are a little bit up in the air and a little bit messy. So, as we wrap up today's episode, let me just say this. You have some really exciting goals ahead of you. A granny flat, an overseas lifestyle property, an investment property here in Australia, and you're only $30,000 from being mortgage free. That is a remarkable position to be in. And I can say this, a lot of people would be very jealous of your $30,000 mortgage. But I need you to remember this. You don't need to do everything at once. You just need to put the goals in the right order that are right for you. You want to focus on strengthening your financial foundation as a priority and making sure that each investment that you make is actually working for you, has its job, and it will actually help fund the next goal of yours. Your future is not determined by the start date, but actually how intentionally you move forward from this very moment as you get started. Now, if this episode helped you, can you please do me a huge favor and share it with someone who is juggling some really big goals at the moment and really does need some clarity in their financial life as well. And if you have a question for yourself on Start Here, I have popped my email address and, of course, my Instagram account so you can reach out to me at any stage. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening. If you can leave me a rating and review, I would greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you on Monday morning at 5 a.m. on Sugar Mama's Fireplace.